Hi there, and welcome to PodRocket, a web development podcast brought to you by LogRocket. My name is Paul, and today I'm joined with Faris Aziz. We're going to talk about caching, payloads, and as we're going to put somewhere in this podcast, other dark arts. So welcome to the podcast, Faris.
Thank you so much. Really excited to be here.
What are dark arts?
What are dark arts? All the front-end trickery that we've got to twist in to make something work, basically.
Aha.
When everything around the front end, the back end, the infrastructure, the stuff's just not ideally set up, what are the things that we can twist in the world of the web to get the solution where we want it to be?
So we're going to talk about data and requesting things that might otherwise be hard to request.
Yes.
And I'm guessing tying it all together is in of itself a dark art, even if it's just using it on the front end.
100%. I think the overall theme is how do we create optimal user experiences in suboptimal conditions?
What is the suboptimal condition that we're talking about? What are you guys cooking up over in the Faris lab?
So this was like a problem space that I experienced 3 years ago at a fintech where we were working in a super high speed startup in very typical startup fashion. You've got a front end team working, you've got a back end team working, and the priorities are almost never in sync. And when we were developing an API first product, naturally the front ends got to integrate whatever APIs are available that are also being given to partners. Similar to Stripe, Stripe's got their own APIs that we all get to consume and use from, and they can't just update those willy-nilly. Their Stripe dashboard has to also internally consume those APIs. And so when I was building this fintech dashboard, I had to work with a limited set of APIs to get things working. And so this talk ended up just evolving, getting a little bit crazier over time, to the point where when I presented at React Summit New York last year in November, that suboptimal condition I really wanted to test was I recorded all the demos of the solution on the flight from Switzerland to New York on the network conditions of the plane, be able to see, does this theory actually hold up in practice? So the Faris lab is just cooking stuff up on a plane because I'm always traveling everywhere.
So you were cooking up a demo for a fintech dashboard.
Yes. Imagine if you open up your Stripe dashboard, you've got to see a bunch of transactions, right? I made X amount of money every single day.
Sure.
And so in a similar fashion, I was building a fintech dashboard at a fintech company I was working at, where if I logged in as a user, I had to display transactions that were made. And let's say we had to display transactions for the last 3 days, 7 days, and 30 days. And we assumed, because we did not have enough users at the time, that you're not really going to be displaying more than 5,000 transactions. So your 30-day view, we would just request up to 5,000 transactions. Now, where things got problematic is that you naturally have SLAs when it comes to building an API first product, and you got to abide by those service level agreements when you're selling a contract to another company. And you're like, if they're paying us money, this thing has to work at a certain level from a performance perspective, reliability, availability, so on and so forth. And so when we had to query for our transactions API, there's naturally a limit. Like, how many can I request? Can I request 1,000, 2,000, 3,000? And we wanted to request 5,000. The problem really here was the limit was 1,000 at a time. We could not request more than that. And if we went to the backend team and asked them, hey, can you increase this limit for us? We'd break the SLAs because the queries at the database level or something else weren't performant enough to upkeep at anything beyond 1,000. So what is that first dark art that we employ? We got to make 5 parallel requests on the front end, and that's where all the fun starts, because now you start introducing 5 points of failure. So that's where it really comes from.
Okay, that definitely paints the picture for me and the problem that you were faced with. So when you went and took the pencil to the paper, is this something that you felt was net new in your career arc of having to facilitate this paralyzed front end cacophony into something that made sense?
At the time, a little bit, yes, right? Because you're seldom cooking up solutions in isolation. When you're working with a team, you got to get buy-in. You got to figure out, okay, you're first going to argue, why can't the backend make this change? Why aren't you fixing things at the database level? Why is the front end compensating first?
Right.
So you're more dealing with architectural conversations to make sure that you're implementing the right solution than the backend compensating for the front end and vice versa, or the front end compensating for the backend. You seldom want to do that, but you got to be pragmatic at some point, and you got to be like, okay, the front end's got to maybe implement this for a month or 2 months till the roadmap aligns. And then at some point we'll have a data warehouse or another endpoint that gets us where we need to be. Long story short, that solution was in place for 2 years. And I don't think that would surprise many people because
No, of course.
everyone's like, this is a temporary fix, right?
Of course, the temporary fix.
Yeah, that's the legendary temporary fix.
How's that temporary fix fixing right now?
It held up pretty well, actually.
Let's go.
It held up pretty well. And I faced things now working at Smallpdf that are almost the opposite scenario, because this was a startup that had very few users, and those were large enterprise users. You were connecting with merchants that were payroll providers to be able to make large transactions for salaries or employer of records or so on and so forth. So you don't have that many users. Whereas at Smallpdf, we got upwards of tens of millions of users per month. So the strategies you employ in one place to fix the same solution you cannot employ in another product, which is really interesting. Maybe we'll get to that a little bit later on. It held up pretty well because there's a lot of magic you can get done with TanStack Query, and that's really the crux of it. And there's TanStack Query, and also just being able to leverage Next.js API routes to be able to implement a backend for frontend pattern or a proxy, to be able to at least have something that's managing aggregating all the data or getting it in the format that you want to, because whatever the front end needs to process or you want to put in your client state is not necessarily whatever you're receiving from the backend. And we were receiving massive payloads. So every single object within this array of 1,000 items that we were receiving had 50 key value pairs, and all we had to display was a chart. So a lot of those key value pairs were going to waste, and we wanted to cache that on the front end too. So we're not going to take the entire thing, digest it on the front end, do all the mapping there, and then cache that, because I think where we landed was a place where we had, I don't know, 1.5 or 1.6 megabytes worth of payload. And that was just these one set of widgets. There's a bunch more stuff you're requesting you want to cache in the front end too. And most caching strategies for offline cache are using local storage,
Huge.
which is going to run out at some point.
Right. So the moving pieces here involve Next.js, TanStack Query, creatively somehow proxying.
Yeah.
You guys are going to be requesting data, putting it in the right spots. And I'm sure there's challenges, like you mentioned, that we'll get into. Before we talk about anything super deep and technical,
Yeah.
Anybody listening, we can also now mention the conference or the talk where this first came out. So where can people find that initial talk that you gave?
So weirdly enough, this is the first talk I ever delivered in my conferencing or meetup career. It was in February 2024 at a React Advanced London meetup. And back then it was called TanStack Query, Next.js, and your BFF for backend for frontend. And weirdly enough, I also could not get into conferences because of the title of that talk.
Oh, that's funny.
Because most of the conferences going there, they were like, wait, there's already Tanner and Dominic speaking at that conference. We don't need another TanStack talk. And so I was like, talk's not really about TanStack, and we had to evolve from there. But it's been at 14 conferences since, I believe. I presented it also this week. So if you just go to my website, faziz-dev.com, or just put Faris Aziz in Google, there are plenty of recordings out there of it. It was at React Summit in New York and a bunch of other conferences with different variants and different lengths. So there are plenty of ways to enjoy it.
And you guys also won Community of the Year, right?
Yeah, that's for Zurich.js. Yeah, the community that I run. We won Community of the Year around about last month, JS Nation. So that was really cool. And we're not even 2 years into having built this community.
Incredible. Okay. And if people wanted to check out that community that you're involved with, would that be?
Zurich.js. And there's Zurich.js Conf happening September this year. And we're flying in some pretty cool people, have an awesome after party at the lakeside in Zurich. And there's a lot of great stuff going on. Actually, I think that we have like 4 or 5 TanStack team members coming. Dominic speaking on stage and running a workshop, but a bunch of the TanStack folk are coming in any case. It's even an offsite for some open source folk to come over.
Oh, incredible.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you're interested in hearing more from Faris, go check out Zurich.js. And now we're going to get back to diving deeper into what we were talking about. Yes. So do you think the best place to start explaining how this creative caching and request works is with TanStack or Next.js from a perspective, or neither?
I find it interesting how we lean on the technologies being used when what I love to express things in is being framework agnostic, because whatever we're going to talk about, you can do in Nuxt, you can do in Astro. It just so happens that I'm experienced in Next.js and in React. And so it's the easiest way to have employed those things. So nothing's really restrictive here. And the only way to do it is Next.js. But there are actually some things that we might talk about later on in terms of the app router and how this journey started on the pages router. But in the app router, there's some really cool things, especially with the Next.js 16.3 release, that you can employ to even take these solutions further. But let's start at the bare bones, right? You need to fetch some information. You need to make 5 requests. Let's take all solutions and libraries out of play. And just assuming you have a bare React application, you're going to make a either promise.all or promise.all settled multiple fetch requests on a client side. And let's say maybe you just throw that in a use effect. Let's just say that. Now, David K. Piano, if he's listening out to this, he's going to say a couple of things about use effect. So we're not going to keep that as a long-term solution, but that's generally the first place you're going to place some network requests if you start starting out a React application. And that tends to get pretty problematic. In the way I demo this in the application is very rudimentary, in a very rudimentary fashion, with almost a light mode and dark mode toggle, which in most applications is done with a context provider you set at the global level of an application, and you just flip a switch here and there. And sometimes the problems that come with context providers is that you have then all the children re-render, and it could be that you just then have a remount of a component that has the use effect that makes the 5 requests. And you're getting into a place that when you're trying to fetch non-stale data all over again, you're unnecessarily querying a server, right? And so the conversation starts with, okay, how can I only fetch information when I need to? This is the beautiful model that TanStack starts to present, what it has just in-memory cache from the get-go, right? And so plug and play that stuff with a use query, and you're already in a pretty good place, and you've got resilience patterns baked into that solution. So there are easy ways to do multiple queries with the TanStack query. You've got the query keys for caching if things are going to switch up a little bit with the query parameters. And then you've got all the state management managed for you. And then you've just these different levels of resilience where you can do the 3 basic retries, or generally what's recommended, the exponential backoff. And then you take it a layer above, which is then adding those jitters to avoid those thundering herd problems that, funnily enough, were caused, for example, by the use effect in the September 12th Cloudflare outage, which is a fantastic article to read because Cloudflare has the best postmortems ever.
I actually didn't even know that. That's fascinating.
Which was funny because when I gave this talk at React Summit New York, I think Cloudflare did have an outage, and then David K. Piano tweeted, hey, is it use effect again? Which I don't know if it was that day in November.
Oh, that's funny.
But yeah.
A lot of those things with TanStack Query, I just take for granted at this point in terms of the query caching and all those things that you had to you're like in this and this. I'm thinking in the back of my head, oh, wow, yeah, all those things are existing and working for me. And sometimes I don't even think about it. And it does get you really far. You can serve most table stakes experiences, I would say, with just TanStack out of the box, maybe adjusting some of the TTLs on different queries and such.
100%.
So where did the line get drawn where you needed to reach for something else?
So before even going to that, something interesting where we take things for granted with TanStack Query is that you have that query cache that exists where if something is not stale yet, there's a re-render that occurs. It's just going to go and reach for the freshest state that it keeps in its cache. And so it's going to render that. Where I demoed this in the demo application where you have this toggle for light mode or dark mode, which with the context provider meant to show this example that refetches occur, you can even have TanStack Query almost compensate for incorrectly setting up your state management architecture. Whereas even if something re-renders just because you're using a use query and it gets something from the cache, you're not triggering unnecessarily those use effects that you may have because of referential updates that would have occurred from the dependency array. But yeah, so where did we have to fetch for something else? Now, you're making 5 requests. Every additional request you're making is a point of failure. So what happens if one of those 5 requests fail? Now, do you re-request all of them? Do you manage the individual one that's requested that fails? Do you have a global loading state? So you wait for all 5 to complete and then you aggregate them. And that's where you start getting into UX challenges. And that's where we talk a little bit about response timelines. And there's this really good excerpt from this book called Usability Engineering, and maybe we can link it somewhere, where if something renders or loads within 0.1 seconds, the system feels instantaneous. But the second it takes a second or longer, That's the limit for somebody's flow of thought. And especially in a workflow-oriented experience where you're clicking through stuff and you're moving and dragging and dropping, the second something takes longer, you start to think, and it's like, I'm out of my flow of thought. I'm out of my process. I'm thinking more about the UI now and what's going on. I have to reset myself that I am thinking about the intention I have or the task I want to complete. And you never want to get a user there. So generally, if you have 5 pretty bloated requests, it's rare you're going to get yourself in a place where that's all loading in under a second. And so when I tested this on an airplane, that first initial solution, all 5 requests on the client side roundabout loaded in 13 seconds. Very painful experience. The only time I think you're waiting for a website to load 13 seconds is if it's a government website, or you need to get a visa done of some sort, or you have no choice but to use that experience to be able to get what you need to get done. Any other application that you're using where you have an alternative, you will go to that alternative. And that's where you're going to lose people to your competitors. So then I'm like, okay, the backend can't really deliver me something that I can use easily. So with Next.js, I can spin up an API handler really easily. And so what can we do there by moving these 5 requests somewhere else? Now we're spinning that up in a function as a service, and we're just taking that promise.all settle. We're moving that over to the proxy level. How does that now realistically change things? And that's where you start to understand a little bit more about networking. And we talk about also this 14 kilobyte rule that you may have heard at some point, which is if a network request is under 14 kilobytes, you're requesting a website or a resource under 14 kilobytes, it resolves much faster than something that is of size of 15 kilobytes. And that's just because of the limits of an initial congestion window that exists with a TCP connection, right?
Right. Yeah. TCP backup and all this. Yeah.
Exactly. And so 14 to 15 kilobytes, when I was reading about it, it could be a 600 millisecond difference, but 15 to 16 kilobytes could be just a couple of milliseconds. And that was a crazy thing for me to understand. And I was like, okay, now everything in the world has to be under 14 kilobytes. And this is a bit of an obsolete way of thinking now, because now with Cloudflare or modern CDNs, 14 kilobytes doesn't apply as much. I've seen that in different infrastructure setups, it can be 46 kilobytes, or it's very individually tested based on what you're dealing with. So the goal now is not to reduce every single payload to under 14 kilobytes, but we can now start doing something interesting where I can take that much larger 1.6 megabyte payload, take it to a proxy. I can now condense that and aggregate that into something that I just want to send to the client to render the chart. Nothing else. I don't need any transaction information except how many transactions were done in a particular day. And that's pretty easy. I just have the date and I have the number of transactions. So it's a pretty lean response. And we managed to bring that around about in the example to 300 bytes. So we're even way below the 14 kilobyte limit. And so we already brought ourselves to a place by moving it at the proxy level while I was in the airplane to have the whole thing load in 5 seconds, which starts to get pretty crazy because I'm still making the same requests. I'm on an airplane. I'm still somewhere in the air. Maybe I've moved a couple 100 kilometers somewhere, but I have half the loading time. And so that maybe is a dark art, that just knowing where was the right place and the right tools to use to make that request, you're not getting rid of the problem entirely, but you're starting to think more at the infrastructure level, how that's set up. And that sort of expands your horizons from a front-end engineer perspective, because we often as front-end engineers just limit ourselves to the scope of what we work with. And I like to think more of like, if you're a front-end engineer, you should have front-end expertise, but full stack awareness.
Of course.
Just because you don't have a backend endpoint, right?
Especially today,
Yeah.
a necessity. And going back to your point, Faris, about this is not Next.js specific.
Yeah.
We hopped into the conversation because you mentioned that's the way you solutioned it. But the idea of a proxy that then serves as a middle chunker,
Yeah.
if you want to call it that, and serves it up to your front end, you could do that anywhere. You could do it on a Cloudflare worker.
100%.
You could do it on a Supabase function.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of different places you could do it. In your example, where was Next.js hosted? Because where you host it, do you self-host it? It depends on how that server interactivity works.
I want to say it was AWS or AWS Amplify as a setup.
Got it. Okay.
So it was all on the same infrastructure that it was set up.
Nice.
Yeah. But we also, what was very interesting is that because we were a fintech and you have constraints when you have an EMI license, an electronic money license, which essentially means that if you have a certain level of downtime, you have to report it because you may lose your license for being in the flow of funds or so on and so forth. So availability is a big constraint. And so we, with Terraform, actually had a cloud agnostic setup, which meant that even if you had a regional failure or you had infrastructure failure, let's say AWS was down entirely for where we needed to support it, you could have the entire thing up on GCP super quickly.
Very cool.
And the way that was set up was making sure that you weren't tied to a cloud provider's native solutions that weren't available anywhere else. Like object storage is available in multiple places, but AWS Amplify is sort of an orchestrated solution that it's harder to maybe tie away from.
Exactly.
And so that was also a constraint to think about.
And do you think that the mindset shift here, a takeaway could be something of that form, which is you want to use object storage. It doesn't have to be object storage. It could be like a Cloudflare worker, but think about the infrastructure component that makes your experience shine.
Yeah.
And then what happens if it's only beholden to Next.js, not good, or like Vercel as a hosting provider?
Like, what's your cost?
Yeah, exactly. So what other types of utility do you think that this could provide to, especially like that type of persona you mentioned, Faris, which is the front end oriented developer looking to take advantage of augmenting their experiences?
Yeah.
Because anybody listening to this is probably going through their head and thinking, what big data do I have? I don't have big data. So therefore, none of this really applies to me.
It's less so about big data, and it's more about asking why. Why did me moving these requests from the client to a proxy change things? Why was TanStack Query an interesting solution here? And what is the cost of taking it away? Or what convenience am I buying by implementing a super easy solution that's natively available to some cloud provider? And what's the cost when things go wrong here? Or maybe I can even flip things where some of these solutions don't necessarily pan out if you flip to another product. Now, I don't have these problems at Smallpdf. At Smallpdf, there are no bloated APIs that I have to work with because I work with a backend team that I can ask for a brand new endpoint. I literally had a call today. One of our endpoints were working. It was like, hey, let's just make a new one. Great, we can spin it up in a day. No problem. Nobody else is going to consume it but us. Where things get interesting at a different level of scale, even if you have lean endpoints, is now what do your resilience patterns look like at scale? Everyone using TanStack Query may just have your global default of 3 retries. That sounds pretty safe until it isn't, where I've seen actually outages occur as a result of retries. We've got easily 50,000 users every 30 minutes. So even if you deploy something and something goes wrong, you'll find out pretty quickly.
That's insane.
That is insane. I've never seen something like this. Like, it's a 13-year-old product. We don't even use Sentry. We use something called Track.js. And I think even back in the day when they used that, the expense of moving over to Sentry because of some ingestion limits or the amount of errors we had to ingest, it was just unfathomable. Like,
that's exactly what I was thinking about. It's like volume of the ancillary systems is insane.
I've seen days of 120,000 errors in a single day, and it's near impossible to digest that. And so your strategic thinking is entirely different. Whereas if you're at a startup with 20 users, in each is a high-paying user, great. You can have a customer support call with them or whatever else, and you have a great day.
Right.
This volume you cannot deal with. So getting to the idea of back of even lean requests and just plug and play with TanStack Query, and you're having a great time, or whatever has retry mechanisms. Now, the system we were using for creating subscriptions on our platform called Recurly, that has a rate limit tied to it. And whether it's 150 requests per minute or so on and so forth, there's any issue that occurs at any point in time where the backend is hitting the upstream provider of Recurly and calling it multiple times, or whatever your subscription platform is, what it could be Stripe or something else, any API, and then you have multiple clients initiating retries, or you're in sanctioned countries or flaky network requests, and you're still hitting and not aborting requests, or a bunch of things that could be going wrong. What we had is a scenario of one request just about overflowing the API limit, and that means all other API requests failed for a 5-minute period. So somebody modifying a subscription doing something else hit the limit, which meant that people couldn't even create subscriptions because it wasn't a quota that existed per endpoint. It's a quota that existed for an entire provider or per entire user. So you can get to a place where you can plug and play all the resilience patterns you want to, but then either you're exhausting your quotas, you're not doing caching correctly because you should be doing almost very selective caching, not singular rules per data type. knowing what's offline, what you're happy with in memory. And then there's costs associated with it, especially in a world where you have usage-based billing, which is becoming more and more popular with tokens that we're consuming versus standard API costs. Your usage billing could just shoot up just as a result of you inefficiently doing retries. And so we had to introduce the concept of what is a retryable error? What is a failure that we define you should be allowed to retry? And naturally, a 400 error, validation error, something being a bad request, you should never retry something like that. But it's also a non-200 request. So a blanket rule would naturally re-request or do a retry without thinking twice, because we set these rules up very simply.
And I've seen that firsthand too, especially using serverless products.
Yeah.
The serverless Redises of the world, that you can quickly rack up huge bill.
Yeah.
Because you were working with Claude or something. You said, hey, this is slow, or like whatever, throw Redis caching. Please don't do that.
Yeah.
You have to cache with purpose and deliberately, or you're going to run into those types of issues.
Yeah. I think we're seeing this also all over the place with vibe coded apps these days too, where like infrastructure bills are going through the roof because just hammer the database as much as you want and then you'll get the end result, but it's going to be costly.
So Faris, where do you think people should look if they want to explore these thoughts with a bit more depth? Because there's a lot of content out there right now, and I'm one who loves to also talk about AI tooling.
Yeah.
But this is something that was refreshing to talk about. It's really about architectures and systems and how we build.
Yeah.
So where are you going right now to find more content and inspiration to explore these thoughts?
I'm very lucky to be so deeply ingrained in the conferencing circuit where I get to see and learn firsthand, and maybe even see outages on the day that I'm talking at a conference, right? And so there's no better way to learn than from failure. I love postmortems. Actually, I love reading postmortems because I'm like, you reached either a limit of a system or a limit as a result of your ways of working. Because something is either a cultural or engineering setup problem, or something actually is a technical problem. And so learning through how other human beings collaborate, they see and look at problems is really, really useful. And that's what I love about going to conferences. I've seldom learned a lot just watching a 20-minute talk, because generally it's a 20, 30-minute short talk. You get a snippet of an idea of the questions you may want to ask, and then the hallway track where you're sitting either at the speaker's end or you're sitting like afterwards in a talk and you're knee deep asking what's going on with the internals of somebody who's maintaining a library. Like I delivered this exact talk in front of Dominik Dorfmeister in Vienna earlier this year. And so first of all, I was like, I'm delivering a TanStack Query talk in front of the guy that maintains TanStack Query. That's an interesting experience, first of all. And on top of that, Aurora was also there, and it was a Next.js talk. So I firstly felt misplaced. And secondly, what an incredible place to be where I have the experts in the technologies that I'm trying to talk about. And they had such wonderful feedback. And then Dominik and Aurora were like, hey, you talk a lot about Pages router, and you talk about at some point in an optimal way, in an optimal scenario, if you wanted to do server-side rendering for this request, instead of doing CSR, what you could do is make the request to the proxy and it gets server-side props. But a limit you introduced there is that if you're making a blocking request on the server, you're not rendering any initial HTML, and then you have that loading indicator in a browser, and there's nothing being sent to the client. So there's nothing interactive, no loading states, nothing like that. And so I was representing that as a problem and an excuse to introduce a timeout mechanism as a resilience pattern. And they were like, hey, with Next.js 13 or with partial pre-rendering or with streaming and suspense boundaries, you can actually start the request on the server and you could stream that over to the client. And now I naturally could have also maybe read this somewhere online, but you don't have a case every single day where you've got TK Dodo and Aurora to be able to bash out the problem yourself and figure out the solution. But there's so many resources on Blue Sky, on Twitter, and they're incredible people sharing their knowledge, looking at how people are solving problems in open source. You have the Switch was an incredible project and a feat of performance work to improve how we go through the NPM package registry. There's a lot to learn there and a very welcoming community. And I think it's very refreshing in a world where I've started to struggle a little bit more reading online content just because there's a lot of slop out there and a lot of regurgitated articles in the form of something that's been AI written. And you get also a lot of exhaustion or overwhelming seeing everything in a written fashion, and you're almost getting review fatigue. right? I'm reviewing what my LLM is showing me, my reviews, things are getting meta where Claude reviews the code and I read. It's a lot. So being conversational, intentional, following the right projects and the right people will take you really far. And being open to engage in the right conversations and developing interpersonal skills will take you far further than going and just me suggesting a particular blog website.
Cheers to the new internet, the meta internet.
Yeah.
And if people wanted to find more about you, Faris, I know you mentioned your site earlier. Could you just remind listeners where to go?
Yeah, luckily my name is SEO friendly. So Faris Aziz, you pop it into Google. There's a website called Faziz, FAZIZ-dev.com. I recently did purchase farisaziz.com, so I do need to make that switch. Yeah, and you can find out a lot more information, but I'm also super active on LinkedIn, Blue Sky. So happy to also have people reach out to me and me send them links. But all my talks are up on my website, and I also version them almost like a Git history in a sense. So you can actually see the evolution of talks and improvements along the way, and which one had higher success at different conferences to be able to understand what were the different phases of its evolution.
Yeah, that's really cool. I'm sure there's a lot of presenters that would appreciate something like that to help tune their own. Anyway, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully we can have you on again soon to talk about more actual engineering and architecture one-ups.
Yeah, with pleasure. Thank you.